The annual autumn flower show in Flaxborough had always been more about reputations than roses. The chrysanthemums, dahlias and marigolds were certainly arranged with evident pride, but they were outshone by the subtler displays of human vanity that clustered about them. A counsellor's carefully rehearsed modesty, a vicar's faintly congratulatory smile, or Mrs. Blenkinsop's tendency to hover just near enough the prize table to be mistaken, if only fleetingly, for a judge. It was during the judging of the decorative teacup competition, a novelty class introduced with much unease by the Women's Guild, that the commotion occurred. Competitors had been asked to present their most delicate china, each cup and saucer accompanied by a small arrangement of autumn blooms. It was intended, said the vicar's wife, to demonstrate refinement in both porcelain and petals. Mrs. Wetherill, whose devotion to bone china was exceeded only by her devotion to recounting the scandals of others, had just bent low to inspect her neighbour's entry when the matter intruded. From the end of the trestle table, where a somewhat faded teacup rested on its saucer, came a small but distinct sound, the sharp tinkle of something metallic striking porcelain. At first the incident was interpreted as clumsiness. Mr. Laker, the greengrocer, muttered that someone had dropped a hairpin. But when Mrs. Winifred Glossop reached forward to admire the simple bouquet of chrysanthemums in that particular cup, her fingers closed not upon a stem, but upon a small and gleaming object half hidden among the petals. Her shriek, though modest by theatrical standards, was sufficient to arrest conversation throughout the hall. A coin? No, a piece of jewellery. Not quite. Mrs. Glossop drew forth a gentleman's fountain pen, an item which, though hardly dangerous, appeared remarkably out of place in a teacup of blooms. Even more curious was the blot of dark ink upon the saucer, like a spill, hurriedly dabbed and inadequately concealed. The judges, Councillor Harbottle and Mrs. Fanshawe of the Guild, huddled in grave deliberation. Pens in teacups had not been anticipated in the competition rules. Whispers swelled around the hall, a babble of surmise and satisfaction. Someone suggested it was an artistic flourish. Someone else recalled that the late Mr. Glossop, whose widow now trembled before them, had once misplaced a pen at the bank. The fact that the bank had later misplaced a considerable sum of money was not, at that moment, mentioned aloud, though it hovered unspoken between several pairs of eyes. By the time the hall warden restored silence, a certain atmosphere of suspicion had already crystallized, fragile as spun sugar, but no less likely to cling. And it was at precisely that moment that Inspector Purbright arrived, not as a participant, nor as a man drawn to the intricacies of floral art, but because he had been asked, in the gentlest of official tones, if the constabulary might condescend to a small reassurance. He listened politely to the accounts, nodded gravely at the testimony of Mrs. Glossop, and examined the offending pen with the air of a man unaccustomed but not unwilling to contemplate china saucers in the line of duty. His questions were few, his tone mild, but his eyes moved, taking in the flush of indignation on Mrs. Wetherill's cheeks, the curious smirk of Mr. Laker, the rigid stance of Councillor Harbottle. It was, after all, not the pen itself that troubled Inspector Perbrite. Pens could be dropped or even mislaid in cups. What troubled him, though he did not yet say so, was the manner in which the object had been discovered, neither by chance nor by accident, but by the precisely timed curiosity of Mrs. Glossop. And so, while the crowd of Flaxborough worthies debated whether the show should be adjourned or whether the class should be disqualified, Perbrite quietly pocketed a note with the pen's serial number and promised, in his calmest voice, to make a few discreet inquiries. That the teacup competition had been most unbecomingly interrupted was already the talk of the hall. That it might prove to be the beginning of something considerably more serious was, at that moment, only the faintest suspicion. and naturally, Purbright's alone. By the following morning, the matter of the pen in the teacup had swelled to proportions quite out of keeping with its modest origins. The town of Flaxborough, which prided itself on its sense of order and common sense, had not been confronted with a mystery of this particular flavour in living memory. It was not that mislaid pens were unusual, it was that this one had contrived to intrude upon a setting that demanded grace and refinement. To those who thrived on gossip, such a breach was akin to lèse-majesté. At 10 o'clock, the queue at Jubb's bakery was longer than usual, and not because the Friday buns were especially fresh. Mrs. Blenkinsop, taking up her customary position near the front, explained to anyone within earshot that the pen was unquestionably a sign of malicious intent. The object, she insisted, must have been planted to embarrass Mrs. Glossop, whose taste in chrysanthemums she had always considered vulgar, if not outright defiant, of nature's gentler palate. A stout woman behind her muttered that Mrs. Blenkinsop was hardly the authority to pronounce on either nature or taste, but this observation was drowned beneath the swell of speculation. In the post office queue, matters took a slightly different turn. Mr. Laker, who had failed to sell more than 3 cabbages that week, was heard assuring an elderly customer that the pen was undoubtedly linked to that business at the bank some years back. He lowered his voice, but not so much as to escape the notice of Miss Teasdale, the postmistress, who promptly added her own embellishment, that the pen bore initials engraved upon it, those of a well-to-do solicitor now, retired to Scarborough. Where she had obtained this detail was never clarified, but once uttered, it was repeated from one end of High Street to the other as if it were an incontrovertible fact. The gossip, inevitably, reached the snug bar of the Fox and Hounds by early afternoon. There, over pints of bitter, Mr. Poole the chemist announced that in his professional opinion the ink stain upon the saucer had been quite deliberate. "Symbolic, you might say," he explained, polishing his spectacles as though this lent authority. "A blot upon one's reputation, if you follow me, someone sending a message." He received approving nods, though one drinker pointed out that he had been known to spill his own ink on prescriptions with regularity, to which Mr. Poole responded with a cough of injured dignity. Inspector Perbrite, meanwhile, listened with quiet patience to the first trickle of reports carried in by Sergeant Malley. The sergeant, a man of sound constitution but limited imagination, seemed impressed by the sheer volume of theories. Purbright, however, merely smiled faintly and asked if anyone had claimed ownership of the pen. Malley shook his head, though he added that Councillor Harbottle had muttered something about foreign manufacture and hinted that no respectable Englishman would stoop to using such an instrument. Later that same day, Purbright took the modest step of strolling down the High Street himself. It was a habit that served him better than any formal interview, for townsfolk were always at their most candid when they believed their words reached only the ears of their neighbours. He paused at the greengrocer's stall, feigning interest in the cauliflowers while hearing Mr. Laker retell for the 3rd time that morning how the pen must have been smuggled in. The inspector noted the relish with which this theory was offered, and the sidelong glance toward Mrs. Wetherell, who happened to be passing with her shopping basket at that moment. Purbright's expression gave away nothing. He purchased a modest apple, thanked Mr. Laker courteously, and continued his walk. By the time he reached the market square, the pen had acquired a more sinister reputation. Someone insisted it had been dipped in poison. Another, that it contained a secret note. Both claims dissolved upon inspection, but they added to the flavour of unease which by then hung over Flaxborough like a fog. In the parlour of Mrs. Glossop's semi-detached house, meanwhile, a small audience had gathered to console her. She recounted the shock of finding the pen among her chrysanthemums with such embroidery that it resembled a tale from one of the Sunday magazines. Her hands fluttered at her throat as she described the chill of evil intent she had felt upon touching it. Those present murmured their sympathy, though more than one of them wondered privately if her performance was not a trifle exaggerated. Yet none dared say so aloud, for Mrs. Glossop had a reputation for remembering slights with biblical tenacity. Back at the station, Purbright made a quiet entry in his notebook. He did not, as others might have done, list suspects or motives. Instead, he wrote only 3 observations. First, that Mrs. Glossop had discovered the pen with remarkable promptness. Second, that several citizens had already woven the event into existing grudges. And third, that no one had yet expressed simple curiosity about who had lost the object in the first place. It seemed to him an odd omission, though in Flaxborough, where scandal was meat and drink, the practical often yielded to the entertaining. The day closed with the Flower Show Committee holding an emergency session in the vicarage drawing-room. Mrs. Fanshawe, indignant at the disruption, proposed cancelling the decorative teacup class altogether. Councillor Harbottle insisted that to do so would amount to surrender before a campaign of subversion. The vicar himself murmured that perhaps the incident was only a regrettable accident. His view found little favour. The meeting adjourned in gloom, with the sense that something vaguely menacing, though still undefined, had been lost upon their orderly little town. And so Flaxborough settled into an uneasy weekend. The pen remained in police custody, the chrysanthemums withered, and the teacup was quietly restored to its owner, though with less admiration than before. Yet for all the speculation, no one felt any closer to understanding the matter. No one, that is, except Inspector Purbright, who, sitting late in his office with a small lamp and an untouched cup of tea, smiled almost imperceptibly at the thought that something so small as a misplaced pen could so quickly unravel the fragile fabric of communal respectability. By Monday morning, the pen had ceased to be an object and become an emblem. It hovered in conversations like a spectre, never directly seen but always implied. In the council offices, clerks spoke of it in cautious tones, as if the mere mention might carry consequences. The women of the guild, however, were far less reticent, ensuring that their every sentence began or ended with some allusion to the thing in the teacup. Inspector Perbrite, who had neither hurried nor dawdled in his response, decided that the time had come for a few modest inquiries, not with the intention of reaching conclusions, but merely to let others supply them for him. He began with Mrs. Glossop, since hers had been the hand that plucked the pen from among the chrysanthemums. She received him in her parlour with a display of nerves bordering on the theatrical, though her lace collar remained perfectly arranged. The inspector, seating himself with a mild expression of gratitude, asked her to recount the event once again. She obliged with relish, enlarging on the sense of foreboding she had felt, and hinting darkly that the pen might have been intended as a warning. "Against what, madam?" Perbrite asked gently. Mrs. Glossop paused, startled, before suggesting that perhaps her late husband's financial affairs, which had been somewhat intricate, might still cast a shadow. Perbrite nodded gravely, but made no note. He understood that some people, when given a stage, would supply any number of tragedies, provided the audience remained patient. His next call was upon Mrs. Wetherill, whose teacup had stood beside Mrs. Glossop's. She proved less interested in drama than in insinuation. According to her, the incident had been contrived entirely for attention. Mrs. Glossop, she said with a pointed sniff, had always coveted the limelight. If anyone were to profit from such a spectacle, it would be she. Purbright listened, his expression neither approving nor doubtful, and asked only whether Mrs. Wetherill herself had noticed the pen before its discovery. She had not, though she claimed the ink stain must surely have been visible to anyone with half an eye. As he left, the inspector noted that Mrs. Wetherell's indignation had little to do with pens or ink, and much to do with long-nurtured grievances over chrysanthemums and parish hall seating arrangements. From there, Purbright made his way to Mr. Laker's greengrocer shop. The man, rosy-cheeked from a morning among cauliflowers, was eager to share his view. He was convinced the pen was evidence of a prank, and a clumsy one at that. "Mark my words, Inspector, some wag thought he'd cause a stir, and he's managed it. They'll be laughing their heads off in their parlour this very minute." Pressed to say who this wag might be, Laker grew vague, muttering about youngsters with no respect. Purbright bought another apple, thanked him kindly, and left him to his vegetables. At the vicarage, the inspector encountered Mrs. Fanshawe, who was still seething over the insult to the guild's dignity. She declared that only a person of low breeding would treat porcelain so scandalously. When asked if she had seen anything unusual during the judging, she pursed her lips and replied that she had noticed Councillor Harbottle lingering by the table longer than necessary. "He had no business near it, Inspector. His interest was, I felt, unseemly." Perbrite, acknowledging the remark with courteous neutrality, considered that the councillor was seldom described otherwise. The interviews, though individually inconclusive, accumulated into a kind of mosaic. Each participant supplied not facts, but colours, suspicion, envy, resentment, or vanity. What Perbrite collected was not so much evidence as atmosphere, and he was a man who knew the importance of such things. For the truth in Flaxborough seldom lay in documents or fingerprints. It lived in the slight hesitation before a denial, in the careful phrasing of a neighbour's complaint, in the eagerness with which scandal was embroidered. In the late afternoon, Perbrite invited Sergeant Malley into his office. Malley, whose loyalty was as solid as his frame, reported with some pride that he had identified the pen's manufacturer. It was of English make, a respectable Birmingham firm, and not, as Councillor Harbottle had declared, foreign. This discovery, though hardly sensational, removed one layer of patriotic outrage from the discussion. Purbright asked if any local residents were known to favour such pens. Malley hesitated, then suggested that Mr. Poole, the chemist, was often seen with one, though whether this was the same brand he could not swear. Purbright instructed him to make discreet inquiries, then returned his attention to the pen itself, resting in a small evidence envelope on his desk. He studied it, not as an object, but as a message whose meaning had not yet revealed itself. That evening, Purbright took a slow walk through the town, stopping at intervals to observe. At the newsagent's, he overheard two men debating whether the pen might be cursed. At the draper's, Miss Roper confided to a customer that the ink stain looked to her very much like blood. By the time he reached the quiet of his own lodgings, the inspector reflected that Flaxborough had already done his work for him. They had created a web of theories, each entangling a different figure. His task was not to add another, but to see which of the threads was tugged most anxiously. As he poured himself a modest whisky, Purbright considered the pace of events. Nothing, outwardly, had occurred beyond the intrusion of a pen into a teacup. Yet the consequences were spreading like ripples in a pond, disturbing old rivalries, reviving ancient grievances. He suspected that beneath the genteel surface of the flower show something altogether less refined was at play, and though he had yet to discern the pattern, he was content. For in his experience, it was the smallest things, a misplaced object, a half-remembered remark, that most often drew aside the veil of respectability. Thus the inspector closed his notebook, sipped his drink, and allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in Flaxborough the most trivial of disruptions could lead, with patience, to the most revealing of truths. Tuesday morning arrived with a brisk chill that sent townsfolk scuttling more quickly into shops, where the talk was as warm as the air was not. By then, the swirl of conjecture around the flower show had gathered itself into something more definite, a name. Not an official one, of course, no one had yet been so bold as to claim knowledge, but a name nevertheless. And like a seed carried on the wind, it settled in more than one parlour and shop counter. That name was Councillor Harbottle. The reasoning, if such it might be called, was thin but satisfying to those who prized the pleasure of deduction without the inconvenience of evidence. Harbottle had been seen lingering by the table. Harbottle was known to harbour a dim view of the Women's Guild, whose competitions he had once dismissed as parish frippery. Harbottle, moreover, was not above the occasional theatrical gesture when it served his political advantage. From these fragments was woven a tapestry in which he appeared the undisputed author of the pen episode. By noon, several citizens spoke of the matter as though it were already settled. Inspector Purbright, however, was not inclined to rush. He received Sergeant Malley's earnest report on the subject with his customary mildness, merely nodding when Malley declared that folk are saying Harbottle planted the thing. Perbrite asked what Harbottle himself had said. Malley admitted he had not yet asked. "Then perhaps we should," said Perbrite gently, and suggested that the councillor might be invited to the station for a brief chat, provided it was couched in terms that would not offend his dignity. Councillor Harbottle arrived in a state of offended dignity nonetheless, his round face flushed with indignation. He declared the whole affair a travesty, calculated to undermine his reputation. He admitted he had examined the teacups with unusual care, but only, he said, because the entries struck him as lamentably pedestrian. The idea that he had introduced a pen was, in his words, preposterous, libellous, and possibly actionable. Perbrite allowed the torrent to flow, interrupting only with the occasional nod or soft question. Did the councillor, for instance, own a pen of similar design? Harbottle drew forth from his pocket a stubby ballpoint of the sort issued by estate agents, brandished it as proof of his utilitarian habits, and demanded that the police devote their energies to discovering the true culprit. When the interview ended, Harbottle swept from the station with the air of a man whose integrity had survived a trial by fire, though his gait suggested that his confidence was not wholly unshaken. If Harbottle had been the first obvious suspect, he was also the least convenient one. His position on the council afforded him both friends and enemies in equal measure, and any official move against him would have set half the town ablaze. Perbrite, conscious of this, refrained from more than the briefest of internal notes. It was not Harbottle's bluster that concerned him, but the way in which suspicion had attached itself so readily to the man. It seemed almost too neat, as if the pen had been planted not in a teacup, but in Harbottle's path. Meanwhile, the gossip thickened. At the chemist's, Mr. Poole confided to a select audience that Harbottle's temper alone was evidence of guilt. At the post office, Miss Teasdale maintained with conviction that the councillor's wife had looked unusually pale on Sunday morning, a sure sign of her complicity. In the snug of the Fox and Hounds, it was agreed that Harbottle had long needed taking down a peg, and that a pen in a teacup was just the sort of pompous trick he might attempt. It was, as Perbrite observed privately, the kind of prosecution that required no judge, only the momentum of repetition. That evening, Perbrite walked once more through the town, his hands clasped behind his back. He paused by the river, where the light faded gently and the water reflected the lamps of the High Street. It was there that he encountered Miss Roper, the draper's assistant, who happened to mention, without being asked, that she had seen Harbottle in close conversation with Mr. Laker not long before the flower show began, She added, with a delicacy that failed to conceal her relish, that Mr. Laker had seemed unusually jovial afterward. Purbright thanked her, and she hurried away, evidently pleased with the weight of her contribution. Back at the station, the inspector found Mally waiting with news of his own. The sergeant had confirmed that the pen's model was indeed stocked by Poole's chemist shop, though seldom sold. Only 3 had been purchased in the last 2 years. 1 had been bought by a solicitor from Market Greatham, another by the schoolmaster, Mr. Chubb, and the third, curiously, by an unknown customer who had paid in cash and declined to give a name. Mally looked triumphant, certain this was progress. Purbright, however, only pursed his lips thoughtfully. He thanked Mally, placed the report carefully in his folder, and said nothing more. The following morning, Harbottle's fury had not abated. He stormed into the mayor's office to demand a public statement clearing his name. The mayor, a man skilled in the art of appearing both sympathetic and non-committal, promised to look into it and suggested that Harbottle remain calm. But calmness was not a quality Harbottle possessed in surplus, and his aggrieved speeches over the next days only confirmed the town's conviction that he was embroiled in something untoward. Perbrite, however, held back. He had seen many such rushes to judgment, and he had learned long ago that the guilty seldom presented themselves so readily. What interested him was not Harbottle's indignation, nor the town's eagerness to find a scapegoat, but a detail lodged in his memory. Mrs. Wetherell's casual remark that the ink stain must surely have been visible to anyone with half an eye. Why, then, had no one mentioned it until after the pen was discovered? Why had Mrs. Glossop in particular professed such astonishment at its presence when the blot should have betrayed it at once? It was a small point, and Perbrite did not dwell on it. Instead, he allowed the town to do what it did best: talk. For while they argued over Harbottle's innocence or guilt, the inspector preferred to listen in silence, waiting for the one remark, the one slip, that would guide him further. The first suspect had been presented as expected. It was time, he felt, to wait for the next shadow to lengthen. Inspector Purbright had learned long ago that when a crowd fixed upon one suspect with unusual fervour, it was often a sign to look elsewhere. Harbottle, by virtue of his temperament and notoriety, had made himself too convenient a target. It was not that Purbright discounted the possibility, but rather that he felt the solution, if reached too swiftly, would leave the air curiously unsatisfying. And so, while the town entertained itself with Harbottle's supposed guilt, Purbright turned his thoughts to something more subtle. On Wednesday afternoon, he retrieved the evidence envelope once more and examined the pen. His gaze was not on the pen itself this time, nor even on the faint blot of ink on the saucer that had accompanied it, but on the tissue in which it had been wrapped when passed to him at the flower show. It was a folded handkerchief of the inexpensive sort pressed into service by Mrs. Fanshawe in the flustered moment of discovery. He noted the faint trace of powder on one corner, pink, slightly perfumed, and not the sort associated with Mrs. Fanshawe's sober appearance. It was trivial, absurdly so, yet Purbright's instincts twitched. People were careless about objects they borrowed. On their own, they treated them with more caution. That evening, as Purbright walked home, he passed the draper's window. A small display of ladies' accessories caught his eye, handkerchiefs arranged neatly beside stockings and hairpins. The powder, he thought, was very like that sold in the shop, and he made a mental note to inquire in passing. It was not the kind of thing that could incriminate anyone, but such trifles often marked the passage of an object from one hand to another. Meanwhile, the town remained preoccupied with Harbottle. He had redoubled his protests to the point of haranguing passers-by about his innocence. In doing so, he succeeded chiefly in confirming their belief in his guilt. Yet within this chorus of accusation, Purbright caught another note, Mrs. Wetherill had been overheard remarking to a neighbour that the guild ought never to have included a teacup competition at all, since it invited vulgarity. That she spoke of vulgarity while glancing toward Mrs. Glossop's chrysanthemums had not escaped notice. To Purbright, however, the interest lay less in her opinion than in her familiarity with the detail of the ink stain. Once again, she mentioned it with the air of one who had seen it plainly, though no one else had remarked upon it at the time. On Thursday morning, Perbrite called upon Mr. Poole, the chemist, under the pretext of needing liniment. While the man bustled officiously, the inspector inquired whether he stocked face powders of the pinkish hue so commonly favoured by certain ladies. Poole confirmed that he did, and went so far as to produce a box. Perbrite took it with a mild smile, as though politely interested, then returned it to the counter. The chemist, mistaking this curiosity for intent to purchase, launched into a lecture on the virtues of his wares. Perbrite escaped with his liniment and a pocketful of thought. It was nothing, perhaps, but nothing in Flaxborough could be surprisingly instructive. That afternoon, Sergeant Malley appeared with news. He had discovered, through discreet conversation at the post office, that Mrs. Glossop had been seen in the week prior to the flower show at the stationery counter, inquiring about pens of the very same kind as the one discovered. She had not purchased one, or so the assistant believed, but the fact remained that her interest predated the event. Perbrite listened carefully, thanked Malley, and asked if he might keep that detail between themselves for the present. Malley, proud of his find, agreed, though not without some reluctance, for gossip was as natural to him as breathing. The inspector returned to his desk and considered. A handkerchief with powder, a curious inquiry at a stationery counter, a blot upon a saucer, noticed only after discovery. Each was trivial in itself, and yet together they seemed to form the edges of a picture. Still he would not allow himself to guess. He had learned that patience was more rewarding than cleverness. The truth, if waited for, often revealed itself with far less effort than conjecture required. Later that evening, Purbright stopped once more at the Fox and Hounds. He sat quietly with a half-pint, nodding to those who greeted him, but offering no more than polite replies. It was while he sat thus that he overheard a curious remark. A farmer, whose wife had competed in the show, declared that someone had seen a lady slip something from her sleeve as she leaned over the table. The lady in question was not named, but the farmer swore the action had been observed. His companions laughed, dismissing it as a tall tale, yet Perbrite filed it away. The trivial, once again, had a way of becoming less so in time. By Friday morning, the tide of suspicion against Harbottle had begun to ebb. Too many contradictions had surfaced. Some remembered he had been absent from the hall at the crucial moment, others that his manner was not one of mischief, but of disdain. The town, sensing the collapse of its first narrative, cast about for another. Attention shifted toward Mrs. Wetherill, whose sharp tongue and evident disapproval of her neighbour's triumphs made her a convenient substitute. She, for her part, met the whispers with frosty denial. Yet Perbrite noticed that she had grown more guarded in her conversation, as if wary of saying too much. Through it all, the inspector remained outwardly placid. He spoke to few, listened to many, and wrote almost nothing. But in his mind the fragments were arranging themselves, a blot of ink, a trace of powder, an oddly convenient discovery. He sensed that the incident was less random than it appeared, that someone, somewhere, had contrived to place the pen not for amusement, nor for mischief, but for effect. The nature of that effect was not yet clear, but Perbrite felt sure that when the time came, the smallest of details would unlock the whole. And so, as the week drew to a close and the town prepared for Sunday's service, Perbrite sat alone in his office, gazing at the pen upon his desk. It lay there in its envelope, innocuous, yet charged with meaning. He reached for his teacup, sipped, and smiled faintly. In Flaxborough it was not the thunderclap that startled most, but the whisper that followed. By the time Sunday afternoon came, Flaxborough had exhausted itself with accusations against Councillor Harbottle and Mrs. Wetherill. Their names had been tossed about with such vigour that they had grown stale. In their place, fresh subjects of speculation began to emerge, and Inspector Purbright, whose patience had not wavered, found himself with a broader cast of characters to observe. He welcomed the widening of the field, for the truth, he often reflected, never announcing himself with a single suspect, but lay hidden somewhere in the crowded theatre of human spite. The schoolmaster, Mr. Chubb, was the first to step into the light of suspicion. Someone recalled that he had once bought a pen of precisely the same type, and another remembered seeing him in a heated exchange with Mrs. Glossop the week before the flower show. The subject of their quarrel was unclear. Perhaps it was about the prize money for the children's essay competition, or perhaps about the use of the school hall for guild rehearsals. Whatever the truth, the tale spread rapidly, and Chubb was suddenly being spoken of with the kind of relish reserved for those whose authority one resents. At the draper's counter, Miss Roper whispered that Chubb had always been a little too neat with his marking pens. At the Fox and Hounds, a patron swore that Chubb was capable of writing poison letters in his spare time. The idea of him slipping a pen into a teacup for revenge was, in the minds of many, perfectly credible. Perbrite called upon the schoolmaster at his modest lodgings. Chubb received him stiffly, spectacles perched on his nose, and fingers stained faintly with ink. He admitted to owning a pen of the same make, but produced it promptly from his desk, where it lay in a case, full of ink and ready for use. The inspector's questions, courteous but persistent, drew only irritation. "I should think, Inspector," said Chubb, with a sniff of self-importance, "that you might devote your time to genuine crimes. What you have here is nothing more than a childish prank. I'm not accustomed to being treated as if I were a delinquent boy." Perbrite accepted this rebuke with a mild smile, thanked him for his cooperation, and departed. Yet he noted the man's nervous habit of polishing his spectacles whenever the subject of Mrs. Glossop arose. From Chubb, suspicion drifted naturally to Mr. Poole, the chemist. It was he who stocked the pens, after all, and he who had been most eager to interpret the ink blot as a symbolic act. It was suggested, by whom no one could say, that Poole had, perhaps, planted the pen himself in order to drum up business or to draw attention to his superior knowledge of poisons. When Perbrite visited him again, under the pretence of buying a box of sticking plasters, the chemist was quick to deny any involvement. Yet he seemed oddly flattered that his name was being spoken of. "It shows," he remarked, with a gleam of pride, "that people recognize my importance in the town's affairs." Perbrite listened without comment, aware that vanity could be a stronger motive than malice. It was not only men who came under scrutiny. The women of the guild, once thought above reproach, were soon included in the net of suspicion. Miss Teasdale, the postmistress, reported that she had seen Mrs. Fanshawe carrying a small packet on the morning of the flower show which could easily have contained a pen. Mrs. Fanshawe, when asked, retorted that the packet had contained nothing more sinister than barley sugar for her throat. Others muttered about Mrs. Wetherill's sharp words or Mrs. Glossop's too perfect astonishment. Every woman of the guild, it seemed, carried the burden of possible guilt. The town, deprived of one obvious villain, preferred to imagine a whole conspiracy. In the midst of these shifting suspicions, Perbrite found himself drawn to a detail no one else remarked upon. When he returned to the evidence envelope and examined the saucer once more, he noticed that the ink blot had spread in a curious way. It was not the splash of a careless spill, but rather a small, deliberate dab, as though the nib had been pressed briefly against porcelain. It was a trivial discovery, but it struck him as significant. Why press the nib to the saucer unless one wanted to leave a visible mark? The blot, then, was not a mistake, but a signal to whom? Purbright did not yet know. On Monday morning, the inspector resumed his quiet rounds. He spoke with Mrs. Roper, who confided that she had heard the vicar himself grumble about the guild's obsession with teacups. The vicar, she hinted, might have engineered the affair to discredit the women and restore more dignified events to the flower show. Perbrite thanked her for the suggestion, but filed it away with a silent chuckle. The vicar's soul, he suspected, was too weary to engage in such plotting. Nevertheless, he made note of the way suspicion clung to any figure, however unlikely, provided the town found them irritating enough. The circle of suspects now included Harbottle, Wetherill, Chubb, Poole, Fanshawe, Glossop, and, for some enthusiastic minds, even the vicar himself. To an outsider, it might have seemed absurd. To Perbrite, it was perfectly normal. Flaxborough was a place where every grievance, no matter how small, demanded expression. A pen in a teacup was simply a convenient mirror for them all. That evening, Perbrite wrote in his notebook only a single sentence. The pen was not hidden, it was placed to be found. He closed the book, laid down his pen, and leaned back in his chair. The town, with its restless shifting of suspicion, was doing his work for him. What remained was to listen, observe, and wait until the guilty hand betrayed itself, not by action, but by an incautious word or an unnecessary flourish. As the church bells tolled the hour, Perbrite poured himself a modest glass of sherry and reflected on the curious economy of crime in Flaxborough. A theft or a murder, he thought, could shock but not surprise. Men and women everywhere were capable of greed or anger. But a pen quietly introduced into a teacup among chrysanthemums was another matter. It was not merely crime, it was commentary. Someone in that small gesture had spoken volumes about resentment, vanity, and the hunger for attention. The trick now was to decide whose hand had held the pen when the message was written. The town might have tired of talking about a pen in a teacup, but Flaxborough was not given the luxury of quieting down. On Wednesday, scarcely a week after the flower show fiasco, a fresh disturbance arose, one that lent the first a darker shade. It was discovered quite by accident that the vestry at St. Swithin's had been entered and left in an unusual state. Nothing of real value was missing. The vicar's modest silver chalice still occupied its case, and the candlesticks remained untouched. But scattered across the vestry table was a litter of papers, all blotted with ink. On the floor lay a pen identical in style to the one from the teacup. The news reached Inspector Purbright by way of a flustered churchwarden who had stumbled upon the mess when preparing hymn books. To him, it was a desecration of the most serious order. To Perbrite, it was a second ripple spreading from the same stone. He walked down to the church with his usual unhurried step and examined the scene. The papers, minutes from parish meetings, notices for forthcoming fetes, were smeared with lines of ink that seemed more deliberate than clumsy. The pen itself was uncapped, a dark stain seeping into the wood of the vestry table. He looked at it for a long moment, then pocketed it in a fresh envelope. By the time he left, the town was already murmuring. It was one thing to spoil a teacup, quite another to invade the sanctity of the church. The vicar, in subdued tones, hinted that it might be the work of an unstable mind, a person lashing out at symbols of order. Mrs. Fanshawe, less charitable, declared it was clearly the same hand that had mocked the flower show, now emboldened by lack of punishment. Councillor Harbottle, smelling reprieve, thundered that the outrage proved he had been unfairly maligned. The chemist, Poole, remarked that the incident had the stamp of obsession upon it, as though the culprit nursed some private feud with pens themselves. Every comment added to the mounting unease. Purbright, however, remained quiet. He considered the similarities between the incidents, the pen, the ink, blot, the choice of setting. The second felt less like a prank than a performance, staged for maximum effect. Someone was drawing attention, creating a pattern. But patterns in Flaxborough were seldom simple. They wove around grievances and reputations like ivy around stone. He made his rounds with the same courtesy as always. At the school he asked Mr. Chubb whether he had noticed anything unusual near the church in recent evenings. Chubb, bristling at the implication, retorted that he had been busy marking essays and could hardly be expected to patrol the parish. Yet Perbrite noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he polished his spectacles. At the chemist's, he asked Mr. Poole whether more pens of the same kind had been sold recently. Poole replied with a gleam that none had passed over his counter since the flower show, though he could not vouch for purchases in neighbouring towns. Perbrite thanked him and left, reflecting that vanity was once again outstripping veracity. The oddest encounter occurred with Mrs. Glossop herself. She received him in her parlour with a tremor of righteous indignation. "It is, Inspector, as I feared. The pen was a warning, and now we see the consequence of ignoring it. Mark my words, someone is targeting those of us who uphold standards in this town." When Perbrite asked gently what standards she referred to, she launched into a catalogue of grievances against her neighbours, each more petty than the last. By the end of it, the inspector had learned little about the incident, but much about Mrs. Glossop's opinion of human frailty. He left with the faint impression that she relished her role at the centre of events, even if her connection to them was purely circumstantial. That evening, Purbright sat in his office, examining the two pens side by side. They were identical, both from Poole's stock. Yet the ink stains told a story. The blot on the saucer was small, contained like a mark made to be noticed, but not ruinous. The vestry stains were larger, smeared, suggestive of haste or agitation. One act had been subtle, the other clumsy. It was not beyond possibility that they were committed by different hands, though both bore the same theatrical flavour. The inspector wondered if the second incident was not so much an escalation as an imitation, a borrowing of the first to cloak another purpose. By Friday, the gossip had grown dense again. Some argued that Harbottle was still to blame, his innocence in the first matter irrelevant in light of his general untrustworthiness. Others turned their suspicions upon Chubb, whose irritability was now cited as proof of guilt. Mrs. Wetherell was again mentioned on account of her sour view of the guild, and a few, lowering their voices, hinted that Mrs. Glossop's theatrics were altogether too convenient, that perhaps she enjoyed more than the role of victim. Each theory found its adherents, and the town settled into factions, each defending its chosen culprit with the fervour of a football supporter. Perbrite let them argue. He continued to walk quietly among them, noting who defended whom, who changed their story, who volunteered information without being asked. These small shifts interested him more than the crimes themselves. In Flaxborough, truth often announced itself not in deeds, but in the careful dance of reputation. The vestry incident, whatever its true meaning, had already revealed more of the townsfolk than they would ever admit openly. Late that night, Perbrite returned once more to the vestry. Alone, with only the faint creak of timbers above him, he studied the stains again. On one paper, minutes of a meeting about church repairs, he noticed a faint smudge of powder near the ink blot. Pink, delicate, perfumed. The same kind he had observed on the handkerchief from the flower show. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. It was still a trifle, nothing, but in his experience the trifles were where people betrayed themselves, and in Flaxborough betrayal was seldom loud. It whispered, faint as powder on paper, waiting for the patient to hear it. Inspector Purbright was not a man who ever permitted impatience to dictate his movements. While the rest of Flaxborough chased its own tail in speculation, arguing in post-office queues, trading accusations at the bakery counter, whispering in the pews on Sunday, he preferred to sit with silence, letting events settle like leaves in a pond until the pattern beneath could be seen. After 2 pens, 2 blots, and a mounting theatre of outrage, he found the time had come, not for more questions, but for thought. The vestry incident troubled him less for its desecration than for its haste. The marks had lacked the careful artistry of the teacup, that sly placement among flowers where the object was bound to be noticed. In contrast, the vestry bore the look of a child's tantrum, papers smeared and ink splashed without elegance. If it was the same hand, then it was a hand grown careless. If another, then it was imitation, a parody of the first gesture. Either way, the difference was important. Perbrite did not believe in coincidences of this sort. 1 crime could be chance. 2, connected by the same instrument, carried intention. He considered, too, the matter of powder. Twice now he had observed that faint, perfumed residue. Once on the handkerchief that had swaddled the pen at the flower show, and again on the vestry papers. Both times in places where no powder belonged, both times so faint that only one who looked for trifles would notice. It was hardly evidence, yet in Perbrite's world it was the kind of thread that once tugged often unravelled a whole sleeve. There were also the people. Mrs. Glossop, with her fluttering gestures and relish for drama, seemed almost too eager to be associated with the events. One could hardly overlook her pointed remarks about warnings and standards. Mrs. Wetherill, with her sharp tongue, had betrayed knowledge of the ink blot before it was generally known, though she insisted she had seen it plainly. Chubb, nervous with his spectacles, denied involvement, but had quarrelled publicly with Mrs. Glossop. Poole, the chemist, enjoyed the sudden gravity accorded him. Each of them had revealed something, though not all had revealed what they intended. What united them all, Perbrite reflected, was vanity. Not greed, not vengeance, not hatred in its raw form, but the delicate bruising of pride and the hunger for notice. In larger cities, men committed crimes for money or passion. In Flaxborough, the motives were subtler, like the disputes over who arranged the most symmetrical chrysanthemums or who commanded the loudest respect in a guild meeting. The pen in the teacup was not a weapon, but a barb, aimed to prick pride and unsettle reputation. At his desk he leafed once more through the notes Sergeant Malley had provided. 3 pens sold in town over 2 years, 1 to a solicitor, now gone, 1 to Mr. Chubb, and 1 to an unknown customer, cash only. He could not forget Malley's relish in reporting that detail, nor could he forget how quickly the town had pounced on Harbottle as a scapegoat. Someone had been very willing to let suspicion land in that quarter, and Harbottle's bluster had only fed the flames. Yet Perbrite was certain Harbottle was innocent, not because of any alibi, but because he lacked the delicacy of imagination to orchestrate such theatre. Harbottle's gestures were always loud and heavy-handed. The teacup pen was sly in a way that suggested an eye for presentation. He thought also of the farmer's story, that a lady had slipped something from her sleeve at the flower show. The remark had been dismissed as fancy, but Perbrite did not dismiss anything. If true, it suggested calculation, the deliberate concealment of an object until the precise moment it could be unveiled. Mrs. Glossop had been perfectly placed to do just that, her fingers reaching with a little too much certainty into the flowers. Yet if she had planted the pen herself, why the powder on the vestry papers? Unless she, or someone close to her, had wished to repeat the spectacle and overplayed the part. It was then that Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. He did not, of course, know the full truth. He rarely did until the last moment, and even then he preferred to allow others to demonstrate it for him. But he had enough now to begin shaping the test. The guilty, he knew, could not resist revealing themselves when their vanity was pricked. He had seen it too many times before, a denial phrased with too much flourish, an eagerness to explain, a laugh that rang too brittle. When reputation was at stake, the tongue betrayed what the hand had tried to conceal. He rose, closed his notebook, and gazed for a moment out of his office window at the market square. Flaxborough went about its business. Women haggling over cabbages, clerks scurrying with ledgers, children darting in and out of shops. Beneath the hum of commerce, the gossip carried on, invisible but no less powerful. It had already convicted Harbottle, exonerated him, condemned Chubb, and whispered of Poole. Soon it would tire of those names and reach for others. But Perbrite knew that while the town distracted itself with endless debate, he could prepare in quiet. That evening, over his solitary supper, he rehearsed the question he would ask, the little barb he would plant in conversation, designed not to accuse but to unsettle. It would be something slight, a remark so courteous that it could not offend, yet pointed enough to catch in the guilty conscience. He did not know yet whose conscience it would strike, Mrs. Glossop's, Mrs. Wetherell's, Chubb's, or another, but he had no doubt the answer would show itself. In Flaxborough, guilt rarely leapt into the open. It emerged gently, like a blush under powder. As he set down his fork and folded his napkin, Perbrite thought again of the blot of ink on porcelain. A trivial mark, but deliberate, a message, not to the world at large, but to a select audience. It had been an act not of crime alone, but of vanity. Someone had wanted to be noticed, to unsettle, to hint at secrets only they could command. The vestry had been a cruder echo of the same, suggesting either desperation or imitation. In either case, it was no longer a puzzle of objects, but of people. And in that theatre, Perbrite was most at home. He rose, extinguished his lamp, and made ready for bed with the calm certainty of a man who saw the path ahead, even if its end was still veiled. Tomorrow would be the time for his test. Tomorrow, with a single courteous remark, he would invite someone to reveal themselves. And when they did, it would not be with a confession, but with a slip, small, human, and as telling as a pen left in a teacup among chrysanthemums. The following morning, Inspector Purbright stepped into the high street with the air of a man intent upon nothing more ambitious than a stroll. It was his habit to appear casual when in truth his mind was arranged with a certain purpose, and today that purpose was to draw out the guilty hand by the gentlest of means. He had resolved upon his test, a phrase so slight that no innocent would think twice about it, yet sharp enough to catch in the mind of one who had something to conceal. His first stop was Mr. Poole's chemist shop, where he purchased a box of aspirins he did not require. He lingered at the counter, speaking of the weather and the parish notices, until Poole, always eager to display superior knowledge, began expounding upon the danger of ink stains to cloth. Perbrite, in the mildest tone, observed that the blot in the vestry had looked curiously as though pressed by a hand that trembled. The chemist laughed in what he clearly thought a dismissive way, yet the laugh rang oddly hollow. Perbrite, satisfied with that faint discord, said no more, and departed. At the school he found Chubb in his classroom, papers spread before him in disciplined rows. The master greeted him stiffly. Purbright stood a moment, gazing at the ink-stained fingers, and remarked that a man who handled pens daily must surely know how easily one could leave a mark, even upon the wrong surface. Chubb's hand moved instinctively to his spectacles, polishing them furiously, as he declared he had no time for childish pranks. The reply was prompt, but the inspector noted the slight catch in his throat, as though the words had been hurried out before reflection could steady them. From there, he called upon Mrs. Wetherill. She ushered him into her parlour with an air of injured innocence. Perbrite allowed her to speak at length of Mrs. Glossop's vulgarity and the idiocy of the guild's teacup competition. When she paused for breath, he said, as though idly, that he wondered how anyone could have noticed the ink blot so quickly unless they had been quite close to the saucer. Her eyes flickered just for an instant, and her lips tightened before she replied smoothly that it had been plain to see. Perbrite nodded, thanked her with a smile, and took his leave, but the momentary slip stayed with him. The last of his calls was upon Mrs. Glossop herself. She received him with an almost theatrical tremor, hands fluttering as if to ward off accusation. Perbrite listened with the politeness of a man accustomed to long speeches, then remarked that in the vestry, too, a faint trace of perfumed powder had been discovered. The words were spoken lightly, as if of no consequence, but they struck her visibly. She pressed her fingers to her throat and said it was appalling, simply appalling, that such sacrilege should be committed. Yet her colour rose, and in her eagerness to condemn, she overreached herself, declaring that the powder must have been left when the pen was pressed down. Perbrite inclined his head, very gently, and asked how she knew it had been pressed rather than spilled. She stammered, covered with a cough, and turned the subject to her chrysanthemums. The inspector did not pursue it, but the seed had taken root. That evening, back in his office, Perbrite reflected upon what he had seen. None had confessed, nor had he expected them to. Yet each had revealed something. Poole, a hollow laugh; Chubb, a hurried protest; Wetherill, a flicker of unease; Glossop, a slip of the tongue. He did not yet know which strand would prove strongest, but he felt the net tightening. The guilty, he thought, had been unsettled, their vanity pricked. Soon enough they would betray themselves more openly. The town meanwhile buzzed with renewed fervour. Rumour spread that Purbright had conducted a round of stern interrogations, though in truth his manner had been the very opposite. Harbottle, sensing an opportunity to recover standing, declared that the inspector had confided in him personally. The vicar, approached by a parishioner with tremulous concern, said only that the police were pursuing all avenues. Every retelling of these encounters added more weight to the air of expectation. Something was coming. The town was sure of it, and everyone wished to be present when it did. Perbrite, however, was in no hurry. He had observed enough of human nature to know that patience was his ally. Already, in the quiet between gossip and speculation, he could hear the guilty conscience at work. He imagined how Mrs. Glossop must replay her slip, wondering whether he had noticed, how Mrs. Wetherill might fret that her glance had been too quick, how Chubb, polishing his spectacles, would assure himself that his irritation was natural. Each, in their own way, was tightening the rope about themselves. On Friday, he invited Sergeant Malley into his office. Malley, proud of having followed the gossip with a constable's ear, declared that people were growing restless. "They want an arrest, sir," he said earnestly. Perbrite replied with a faint smile that arrests were seldom improved by haste. He instructed Malley instead to prepare a list of all those who had attended the flower show from the moment the doors opened. Malley looked puzzled, but obeyed, and Perbrite returned to his pens, laying them side by side once more. He saw them not as objects, but as lines of conversation, each pointing to a person, each carrying with it the residue of pride. As evening fell, he sat with a lamp burning low, sipping tea that had grown tepid, and considered the shape of the case. It was no longer about pens, nor about teacups, nor even about the vestry. It was about vanity, that most fragile of possessions, and the lengths to which people would go when it was bruised. Someone in Flaxborough had chosen to dress their resentment in ink and porcelain, and soon, with a gentle prompt, Purbright would invite them to admit as much, not in words of confession, but in the small betrayals that vanity never fails to supply. The town of Flaxborough had reached that curious point where gossip, though still abundant, began to circle back upon itself. Rumours repeated, theories contradicted, suspects were named, dismissed, then named again. It was into this climate of restless expectation that Inspector Purbright quietly prepared the moment he had been waiting for. He did not rush, for the guilty conscience was like a kettle left on the hob. It whistled soon enough if one had the patience to listen. On Saturday morning he extended polite invitations to a small gathering at the council chamber. The note made no suggestion of confrontation or drama. It merely proposed, in Purbright's even hand, that certain persons who had been present at the flower show might assist him in clarifying a few minor details. Those summoned were Mrs. Glossop, Mrs. Wetherill, Mr. Chubb, and Mr. Poole. Councillor Harbottle, upon hearing of the gathering, insisted on attending of his own accord, declaring that his honour required public vindication. Perbrite, with his usual courtesy, raised no objection. When the group assembled that afternoon, the chamber held an atmosphere of restrained theatrics. Mrs. Glossop sat erect, her hands folded with pious dignity, though her eyes darted toward her rivals. Mrs. Wetherill, stiff and unsmiling, regarded the proceedings with the air of one prepared to repel insults. Chubb polished his spectacles furiously, while Poole adjusted his cuffs as though he were about to deliver a lecture. Harbottle, red-faced and expansive, muttered that the whole affair was absurd and that he expected an apology at the close. Perbrite sat at the table, calm and unhurried, with Sergeant Malley standing quietly at the back. He began with gentle questions, almost conversational, about the sequence of events at the flower show. Each answered with varying degrees of detail, none straying far from the accounts already given. Purbright nodded, took the occasional note, and never pressed too hard. He let them speak, for people often revealed more when they believed they were merely repeating themselves. Then, when the rhythm had grown almost comfortable, he laid his first card on the table. "I was interested," he said, "to find that in both the flower show and the vestry incidents there was present not only the same kind of pen, but also a trace of powder, pink, perfumed, rather uncommon." His tone was mild, his eyes lowered to his papers. Yet, at the words, Mrs. Glossop's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, Mrs. Wetherill's lips pursed more sharply, and Poole leaned forward with a show of interest that was just a fraction too eager. Only Chubb looked baffled. Perbrite continued, "It seemed curious that such a detail, trivial though it may appear, should recur. Curiosity of that kind can be helpful, you know. It allows one to distinguish between what is coincidence and what is arrangement." He paused, then lifted his gaze just long enough to observe their faces. Glossop's colour had risen, Wetherill's eyes narrowed, and Poole gave a laugh that was half cough. Harbottle demanded to know what nonsense this was, but Perbrite did not answer him. Instead, he produced from his folder the vestry paper with its faint smudge. "It is difficult," he remarked gently, "to imagine how powder of this sort should find its way into a vestry, unless carried there inadvertently. And it is perhaps even more difficult to imagine how anyone could have described the ink in terms so precisely unless they had watched the pen pressed to the surface." His eyes turned briefly, almost idly, toward Mrs. Glossop. She began to speak at once, too quickly, protesting that she had only guessed that anyone could have deduced as much. But in her eagerness she stumbled, referring to the angle of the pen, to the way it had been deliberately held down, words too exact for conjecture. A silence followed, broken only by the scrape of Chubb's chair as he shifted uneasily. Purbright let the silence linger. He knew its weight. Then he said very gently, "You see, ladies and gentlemen, one need not accuse. People reveal themselves, often without intending to. It is, if I may say so, a kind of vanity. We like to display knowledge, to show that we were not surprised, that we saw through the matter at once, and in doing so, we sometimes confess more than we realize." Mrs. Glossop sat rigid, her lips parted as though to speak, then closed them again. Her cheeks burned, her hand trembled faintly upon her handkerchief. Mrs. Wetherill looked at her with a mixture of triumph and horror, while Harbottle muttered that he had known all along. Poole shifted in his seat, caught between fascination and alarm. Chubb stared at his spectacles as though they alone could provide a shield. Perbrite, satisfied that his seed had taken root, did not press further. He rose, thanked them all for their assistance, and dismissed the gathering with his customary politeness. They filed out in uneasy silence, each measuring the others with new suspicion. Outside, the town square seemed brighter than usual, the air sharper, as if the town itself sensed that some conclusion was drawing near. That evening, Perbrite sat alone in his office, the 2 pens before him, the vestry paper, the notes from his interviews. He did not feel triumph, nor even satisfaction, but the quiet inevitability of truth approaching its moment of disclosure. Tomorrow, he thought, it would be time to speak plainly. Tomorrow, in the calmest of settings, he would draw the lines together and show them how the trifles, the powder, the blot, the slip of a phrase, made a pattern no one could mistake. And when that was done, Flaxborough would return to its routines, a little chastened, a little altered, but essentially unchanged. He closed his notebook, extinguished the lamp, and allowed himself a faint, tired smile. Vanity, he reflected, was as enduring as human breath, and it was vanity that had left a pen in a teacup among chrysanthemums, where everyone in Flaxborough was bound to see it. Sunday morning dawned with a pale light, the sort of hesitant brightness that seemed perfectly suited to Flaxborough's mood. The bells of St. Swithin's rang out, steady and untroubled, though beneath them lay a current of restless curiosity. By then, the town knew that Inspector Purbright had gathered certain people at the council chamber the previous day, and though no announcement had been made, speculation had swollen like yeast in a warm kitchen. Faces turned, whispers passed, and a certain nervous expectancy hung over every pew and shop counter. Perbrite, however, went about his Sunday with unhurried composure. After service, he accepted a cup of weak tea in the vicarage parlour, listening with polite attention to Mrs. Fanshaw's indignation about the vestry, outrage. Only when the tea had cooled did he excuse himself, return to the station, and set in motion the conclusion he had long since foreseen. He summoned once more the same company, Mrs. Glossop, Mrs. Wetherill, Mr. Chubb, Mr. Poole, and the ever-insistent Councillor Harbottle, inviting them to the station's modest conference room. The setting was deliberately ordinary, no raised voices, no hint of menace, just a polished table, a neat row of chairs, and Perbrite himself seated with his papers before him. When they had assembled, he began not with accusation, but with thanks. "You have all," he said, in the calmest of tones. "Give me your time and your patience. The matter before us is, in one sense, trifling, a pen in a teacup, a blot in a vestry. Yet in another sense it is not trifling at all, for it touches upon what this town values most, appearances, reputation, the delicate fabric of respectability. And it is because of that fabric, rather more than because of any pen, that we are here." He allowed the words to rest a moment, then continued. "Let me say first what this is not. It is not the work of Councillor Harbottle, however convenient that conclusion may have seemed. It is not either a plot hatched by the chemist or the schoolmaster, though each of them has been drawn into suspicion by their own temperaments. No, the truth lies elsewhere, in something more personal, more, if I may put it so, vain." He reached into his folder and placed upon the table the vestry paper with its faint pink smudge. On this paper, as in the handkerchief that wrapped the first pen, there is a trace of powder, perfumed pink, the sort used by very few in Flaxborough. It is not the vicar's, nor Councillor Harbottle's, nor Mr. Chubb's. It belongs unmistakably to a lady. And not only that, the way the pen was discovered at the flower show was too precise, too timely. Mrs. Glossop's hand went straight to it, as though drawn not by chance, but by certainty. There was a stir in the room. Mrs. Glossop coloured fiercely, her lips parting, but Purbright raised a hand in the gentlest of interruptions. "Madam, you have spoken often of standards, of warnings, of being chosen as the object of malice. But in truth you chose yourself. You placed the pen among your own chrysanthemums. Why? Because you wished to remind your neighbours of your husband's past prominence, to draw attention once more to yourself, to make a modest competition a stage for your drama. The vestry incident, however, was not your doing. That was a crude imitation, someone, perhaps a mischievous imitator, seizing upon your little theatre to add their own flourish. But the original act, the one that set Flaxborough whispering, was yours." Silence fell, broken only by Harbottle's snort of astonished triumph. Mrs. Wetherell sat very still, eyes narrowed in satisfaction, while Poole looked faintly disappointed to find himself relegated to the chorus. Chubb polished his spectacles, muttering that he had known all along something of the sort must be true. But all eyes, inevitably, were fixed on Mrs. Glossop. She attempted to protest, faltering at first, then gaining speed. She declared it monstrous to suggest she would stoop to such behaviour, that her chrysanthemums were above reproach, that she had been humiliated enough without further insult. Yet the words tumbled over themselves, and with each protest her cheeks burned hotter. At last she broke off, dabbing at her face with a powder-scented handkerchief, the faint pink dust rising visibly in the air. It was as eloquent as any confession. Perbrite inclined his head. "No charges will be laid," he said softly. "The law has not been broken, save perhaps in spirit. But the truth has been revealed, and the town will, I think, draw its own conclusions. Vanity, Mrs. Glossop, is a burden many of us carry. Yours, alas, has left a stain more lasting than ink." He rose, signalling the end. The company dispersed in varying states of relief and indignation. Harbottle left, puffed with self-importance, already rehearsing how he would recount the inspector's words. Mrs. Wetherell departed with the rigid satisfaction of one whose rival had been exposed. Poole muttered about wasted time, and Chubb stalked off, spectacles glinting. Mrs. Glossop lingered longest, her dignity crumbling in silence, before sweeping from the room with what remained of her pride. Later, as dusk settled over Flaxborough, Perbrite sat once more at his desk. The pens lay in their envelopes, the vestry paper beside them. He reached for his own pen, dipped it into the ink, and made a final note. Vanity requires an audience. Remove the audience, and the play collapses. He set the pen down, folded his hands, and allowed himself the smallest of sighs. Outside, the town resumed its customary rhythms. The bakery sold its loaves, the chemist his powders, the post office its stamps. There would be talk, of course, plenty of talk, but it would dwindle in time, replaced by new scandals, new slights, new vanities. Such was Flaxborough, and such it would remain. Purbright, content, turned to the paperwork awaiting him, the quiet labour he much preferred. For him the play was over, and the curtain had come down as softly as it had risen.